Hi, everybody. It's Chris Coulter here, and I'm with David Grayson. Hello, David.
Hi, Chris.
So, this is our next installment of All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast, and we are thrilled to have a very special guest today, Tim Christophersen. Hi, Tim. Welcome.
Hi, Chris. Hi, David.
And you are both in Europe or thereabouts. David, you're in London today. Tim, you're in Denmark, I believe.
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Good. And we're kind of nearing the end of 2025 and all of that brings lots of last minute work and then looking to that restorative time over the holidays. So thanks so much, Tim, for joining us. And Tim, you're the VP of Climate Action at Salesforce, and you've been there for about 3 years. And maybe we could begin before we get into some of the things that you specialize in, and of course your book, which we really want to understand more. How did you end up at Salesforce being the VP of Climate Action? How long have you been doing sustainability? What's your origin story?
I've been doing sustainability for a long time, and I spent most of my career in the United Nations and in public service, and before that with the European Commission. I actually never thought I would work for the private sector, to be honest. And then when Salesforce approached me 3.5 years ago, I first had to look up what Salesforce does, and I wasn't. I didn't really know much about the company, but the way it happened was I was working for the United Nations Environment Program at the time, leading their Nature for Climate team and all the work on forests at UNEP. And I advised the Salesforce team and the World Economic Forum a bit on setting up an initiative called the Trillion Trees Initiative, 1T.org, which was Mark Benioff, the chair and CEO of Salesforce's personal action agenda that he was really pushing with the forum at the time. And they'd asked me, because I set up the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration at that time, how to run like a massive private sector undertaking that would restore forest landscapes. And then Salesforce just kept calling me and said, well, now we have this big commitment. Now we have to plant 100 million trees. And how do you do that? Who do you work with? Where do you go? What is important? What do
This is
create?
customer relationship management and action, trying to get you. Yeah.
So then, and at some point they said, well, why don't you just come and work for us? Because we also want to elevate nature on our internal agenda. We want to have a nature strategy. We're looking into water. Why don't you just come? You just start a team on nature. And I at first had to read Mark's book, Trailblazer, where Mark Benioff talks about the business as a platform for change. And that really convinced me to join Salesforce because it's quite a unique company, I have to say, in terms of taking others with us on this journey of sustainability. So it's been an interesting transition from the UN to a multi-billion-dollar global technology company, and it continues to be a fascinating ride, especially now with technological advances in AI. And I've not regretted that shift, because I believe one of the things we need in sustainability, and especially in nature right now, is the speed and scale that the private sector has to really make pivots that are transformational. Because I can go a little bit into that in my when I talk about my book, because there's some of those stories in it where suddenly we find ourselves at an existential crisis where you need an emergency response, and you need the best of both worlds there. You need public sector clarity and policy signals and fiscal incentives, but you also need the speed and scale and this sheer the immense entrepreneurial capacity that only exists in the private sector.
And Tim, we really do want to dig into this, what's the best of both worlds, and indeed the best of all three worlds with civil society as well. But I'd like to just probe a little bit more about the origin story, because literally you grew up with nature, particularly with I think your grandfather. So that just maybe helps our listeners to understand a little bit more, and indeed our viewers now, because now that we are also on YouTube as well. But just to help our audience a little bit further to understand Tim the person, just give us a little bit more about that earlier backstory, if you would.
Yeah, so here's a story that only occurred to me actually after I finished writing my book, which is all about nature restoration. generation restoration, that when I was about 10 years old, I actually did my first ecosystem restoration project.
At 10. Okay, great.
I restored the little pond in my grandparents' garden, which was a eutrophied. There was too many nutrients in it. There was not a lot of aquatic life, and so I did a lot of research on which plants could restore that aquatic ecosystem, and then I did a pile of rocks for lizards and other wildlife to come back, and that how nature responded to that was a feeling that has never left me since, because once you do something like that, nature works with you. And that is incredibly powerful, because once we realize that we are part of nature, we are nature's most powerful ecosystem engineers. I don't know, that concept in ecology, like beavers and elephants are ecosystem engineers, earthworms as well, for example, that one species defines an entire ecosystem. Well, humans are that for the entire planet. We are nature's most powerful ecosystem engineer.
The Anthropocene now, yes.
The Anthropocene. So taking on that responsibility and how well nature responds to that, that's been my calling and my passion ever since. So then I studied forestry. I was first at the European Commission and then at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and then 15 years with UNEP. And that's been the thread of my career of how to restore nature at planetary scale. And then what I realized recently is that this is not a technology, it's not a challenge of technology or even finance. It's a challenge of the human spirit, because we have to realize that we are part of nature. We've forgotten that for reasons that I go into in my book. It's actually quite a fascinating story of philosophy.
Well, because your subtitle, I mean, so your book is Generation Restoration, and the subtitle, I think, is the most compelling part of that title, which is How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature. So why that phrasing in the tagline?
So since we're on video, let me just show a copy of the book here so people also recognize what it looks like. Generation Restoration. And it has a foreword by Jane Goodall, who sadly passed away 2 weeks before the book was then finally published. In mid-October. But it's the relationship crisis part. If you imagine for a minute that we were really in family with nature, let's say we were married to nature, we would be headed for a divorce right now, because we're in an abusive relationship. We've all been in relationships that are like that, or hopefully we haven't all been in relationships that are like that, but we know of relationships that are like that. Either a friend or family or somebody always ever takes your time, your attention, your money, your resources. That's
vampires. Yeah.
Vampires. Never gives anything back. And those relationships are toxic, and they end always, one way or the other. So that's the relationship we're in with nature, because our economy is programmed that way. It doesn't have to be that way, because, there's many other ways of really living a beautiful and healthy and wealthy life. But because our economy is programmed on these fundamental principles of reductionist thinking and the separation of humans from nature, that we see nature as a commodity that is here for our taking instead of our family and our home, that leads to this misguided way of having an extractive only and an abusive relationship with nature. So that's what I mean when I talk about a relationship crisis. It's actually a very literal meaning. And of course, if you speak to indigenous people, which I've done a lot, both at the UN and then for the book, they really are in a very different relationship with nature, which is a real relationship of place and of relationship with other species that we share this planet with. And I'm not saying in the book that we all need to live like that, but we all need to give back more time and attention to nature, and we need to learn basic ecological literacy. Because if we don't do that, we can't run our economy. As I'm sure you're aware, that the two words share the same root. Economy and ecology are both from oikos. There's our common home or our household in ancient Greek. And one is the management of a household, and the other is the knowledge of a household. how can you manage something if you don't know how it works? That's at the moment what we're doing, right?
And just to build on that, David, I know you have a question too, but we at GlobeScan, we did a recent global public opinion poll, and in the survey, we asked a question to the world. What is your philosophical perspective? Is the economy dependent upon the natural environment, or is the economy actually quite separate and can, occupy a space without it? 85% of the world believes that they're integrated, that the economy is subsumed by the natural environment. Only 15% of us across the world believe the opposite, that we can decouple and kind of, and yet the conversations are often in that 15%, that especially in a business case context, we're in that having to justify, when the reality is the world, we get it intuitively that no, these things are integrated and required to both be healthy for us to be having a great planet.
And is
Think
is that a way that we start to overcome some of the incredibly polarized debates that are going on at the moment around climate and around some of the three-letter abbreviations, the TLAs like ESG and so on? If there is such unanimity, and I think, Chris, we also saw in a different GlobeScan poll recently that even in the US, with all its current debates and divisions, there was a great uniformity of support for the idea that we need more action on things like water and the water crisis. So, do we see that this emphasis on nature and the importance of nature and making those links back to oikos and so on is part of the way that those of us who believe that we are in the Anthropocene, and we do have to address this crisis, can start to build a new social and political consensus, which is desperately needed if we're going to tackle the problems.
I think the answer to that is yes, because if you go deep to our roots as a human civilization, as the human race, we are hardwired to like nature. As the biophilia theory by E.O. Wilson, that basically we grew up alongside ecosystems, and like many other species, we have a very closely knit connection with our natural surroundings. For many people, especially living in cities, of course, that is somewhat buried, but it's never forgotten. I think I yet have to meet somebody who does not like nature in some way or form. That is extremely rare. And
Yeah,
I
hard to
think
find.
it depends on the narrative. How you speak to people across the political spectrum. Everybody wants clean water, clean air, wants a healthy environment, wants green spaces in their cities. And you don't have to call that climate adaptation, or you don't have to call it biodiversity conservation. You talk about what is important to people. And to your point, Chris, that of course the economy is 100% subsidiary of Mother Nature. There's no doubt about it, because what did we eat for breakfast, right? Where did that come from? If there is no functioning nature and there's no ecosystem services, of course there's no economy. But seeing it that way is beyond the vision and also beyond the task of individual companies. Their main purpose is, of course, to make money, unless you're a B Corp, for which I have huge respect. But so companies by themselves cannot solve this dilemma. Governments can only solve it if they have the backing of the population and if they work with the private sector. So I think that's where we're now headed, that there's more collaboration across this spectrum and more public-private partnerships. But we also need a basic reset of some philosophical autopilot parameters that we're flying this whole planet Earth on, that are not working for us.
And what's your title is VP of Climate Action, yet we are talking about nature, and of course they're deeply intertwined. Yet the valence or the the frequency of how we describe some of these things is very climate centric, and the climate cops are much more ubiquitous and bigger attention than historically the nature cops have been, et cetera. And I think and not that it's a mistake because they're both important, but there is something about climate change that's very engineering. The word decarbonization on its own is a very engineering mindset. In talking to the average person, climate versus nature, people, when you ask them, what does success look like on climate change? And it's basically, we survive, we don't die. It's good. But on nature, it is much more infinite. And I think it's that biophilia you're talking about. People can imagine a robust, thriving nature. You ask them, okay, now, can it be better? And they can do that. They can do that infinitely because it's something different. So there's a catalytic energy to nature and a framing, partly philosophical, but partly conceptual, that is distinct from climate. And I wonder, and I think we still struggle in the business community broadly on what's front, and are they together, or is there a hierarchy, or the same thing? How are you wrestling with that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question to ask me because I used to work for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the sister convention to the
Right.
UNFCCC, and I helped to organize 3 biodiversity COPs because there are also nature COPs, as you know.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so I'm maybe biased on that question, but I do believe they should actually be merged. There should be one COP for the planetary system stability, and they should merge the 3 Rio Convention. But I no longer work for the UN, so I don't make that call. But separating these things is confusing people, and especially for the climate. If you talk about carbon dioxide, which is a gas you can't smell, see, or feel, very abstract to people. Whereas if you talk about clean water, you talk about the species around, you talk about the birds that are in the park or that used to be in everybody's garden that are now gone. You talk about that I went fishing as a boy when I was, again, in my early teens, and we were fishing European eel. There's a species that was really ubiquitous, very abundant species in Europe at some point. In the last 30 years, the population of European eel has crashed by 95% within my lifetime, which means my children don't get to do this because that opportunity is gone. And that really deeply matters to people more than the measurement of CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere on Mauna Loa. But they are connected. It's the same. And I think underlying these connected issues is this question of what is our relationship with Earth as a system? Are we disinterested passengers who are just observing that the whole system is crumbling? Or are we connected with the system? Are we part of the system? Are we part of nature? Because when you answer that question, the answer to what you need to do becomes very different. Whether you're in business or you're in government or you're a civil society leader or just a citizen, it suddenly matters to you very much because you're talking about our home, talking about our family, then that matters to everybody, no matter who you are. And I think having the discussion at that level where we ask ourselves the bigger question, I think it was Churchill who said sometimes you need to make a problem bigger to solve it. We have to zoom out a little bit and ask ourselves the more fundamental questions rather than the technical. The technology is there to solve all of this, right? And we have the engineering, we have the science, we have the knowledge, we even have the money. We have lots of money to solve all of this. No problem. Just think of the $7 trillion per year that are spent on fossil fuel subsidies at the moment. You redirect most of that, problem solved. But why we're not doing
21
it?
trillion on the pandemic, I think we did collectively. So yeah, if we
Yeah, we
need
can solve.
a couple
We can
trillion,
solve
we could
things
do
quickly, and if the political will is there. So the question is, why is the political will not there? And I think that is a question of the narrative and the underlying story that we tell ourselves as human civilization. And part of that story has to be, again, that we are part of nature. And to your earlier point, Chris, why is this not more predominant in boardrooms? The reason is that nature was always there. It's just sort of like your parents when you were a kid, like they're just always there and food's always in the fridge and you're just like, you don't have to worry about anything. Well, guess what? We're now at the end of that period of adolescence, I think, and suddenly we have to take responsibility that there is natural capital. It's run out. We've overdrawn our natural capital bank account. So taking nature for granted doesn't work anymore. And now what do we do? So it becomes a very different question seen that way. But breaking it down to the individual company's balance sheet is still a challenge. Huge kudos to the task force on nature-related financial disclosures and other efforts that are breaking it down to the business for each sector. What does it mean if you're a technology company, if you're manufacturer, consumer goods? We need those
And
frameworks.
nature and the nature positive initiative that Marco Lambertini,
All
these things, these are relatively novel parts of this ecosystem, which is exciting.
Yeah. All of it is hugely helpful. I think it still needs to add up to something more, though. And I'm very hopeful about this narrative of the bioeconomy. You know that
Yes. Yeah.
Brazil has been pushing this in the G20. The EU now has a bioeconomy strategy. It still has to be filled with more life and more definition, but it really clicked for me when I was in the Amazon last month at COP30 what the bioeconomy could be. Because I was in Belém, and the city is surrounded by a river. It's near the ocean. It's in the Amazon. You're just overwhelmed by the biological richness of the place, and yet it's a relatively poor city. But the buzz in terms of how you can live with nature and benefit from nature as a human civilization is incredible. All the innovation going on the bioeconomy in the state of Pará, all the political leadership to phase out deforestation from the entire cattle value chain, for example, is phenomenal. And then I visited Mombac, one of the amazing startups in Brazil in the nature restoration industry. They're now doing restoration of the Amazon forest in 20,000 hectares with native species. And this is industrial scale nature restoration. This is, I think, where we need to get to, where the role of business becomes critical in turning things around.
And David, I know you have a question, but just to clarify, how do you describe the bioeconomy, Tim, for our listeners? How would you define it?
It's an economy where activities are based on biological cycles. They're based on biodiversity and on working with biodiversity instead of extracting it. And it's an economy that is circular and inclusive. All the things that our current economy often isn't, because it is extractive, it is one way, it is exclusive, it creates a lot of inequality. So we can get to a better economy, and the many frameworks that are brilliant, like Kate Raworth's donut economics framework, and there are as many frameworks as there are probably nations, because the economy is a social construct. It's not it's not a natural law like physics. It's what we make of it. And the bioeconomy could be that economy that if we rebuild our natural capital and this flywheel, nature works like a flywheel, right? The more diversity it has, the more speed it gains and the more abundance it creates, and then the more you can actually sustainably harvest. Our current economy, and especially industrial agriculture, is slowing that flywheel down and replacing biological processes with fossil fuels and industrial fertilizers. But the flywheel has almost come to a stop. And once it stops, you lose stability in the system, you lose the resilience of the ecosystem, it flips to a degraded state, there are tipping points. So starting up that flywheel again and then running our economy on the energy that is generated within nature is what the bioeconomy is. And I think it is already happening in Brazil, which is why it was so exciting to visit the Amazon.
So Tim, 3+ years in at Salesforce, you said you definitely don't regret switching from the UN system, where you obviously had an important influence. What have been some of the things that you and your colleagues are able to achieve in Salesforce in terms of that speed and agility and innovation that you talked about earlier? What will be some of the highlights of what Salesforce is able to do today or contribute to?
Yeah, let me first say that I love the UN. I think the UN is one of the most important institutions ever created by humanity. I would love the UN to be better resourced, more efficient, more impactful. But even as it is really, really important for us. So it's about collaboration.
It's a tough time for multilateralism right now, isn't it?
It is a tough time, and I have huge respect for all my UN colleagues. I mean, the work they do, and they work extremely hard for often very little gratitude. So I have huge respect to my UN colleagues. I would say what has shifted in the private sector is the the critical mass. Once you have critical mass for an issue in the private sector, things can shift extremely quickly, and that includes numbers of companies doing a certain thing. So let's take the adoption of nature into decision making as one example. A few years ago, when I started in this role, there were a handful of companies. Business for Nature had just started. I sit on the advisory group. TNFD was a new thing. Tony Goldner and his team were just setting out. Um, and look at what we've achieved in that very short time. We collectively, not as we in Salesforce, but playing this role of, we were a piloting company for the LEAP framework of TNFD, how to actually assess your nature footprint. We were one of the first companies, the first large tech companies in the Fortune 500 to launch a nature positive strategy. And then this ability of Salesforce to convene our about 200,000 customers that Salesforce has. Basically, all the Fortune 500 companies, 60,000 NGOs run on Salesforce. So that ecosystem and this relationship of trust that we have with our customers, where their sustainability teams have called me, and I've had so many conversations over the last 3 years with large companies where they say, well, okay, nature, what's this new thing called biodiversity? What do we have to do? What do you recommend? Well, what is where is this headed? Why is this important for us? And being able to speak on a peer-to-peer level, on a trust relationship with other companies, and really planning this out, what can be done, is immensely powerful. It's not, that's not in the headlines, and there's no press releases. There are some of those as well. One of the fun things my team has to do is conserve and restore 100 million trees by 2030. So we have made significant commitments. Salesforce has committed $100 million towards CDR, carbon dioxide removal technologies. We've co-founded the Symbiosis Coalition with Meta, Microsoft, and Google to buy 20 million tons of high-quality nature-based removals. So these are the carbon credits from high-quality projects like the ones that Momback is working on in the Amazon. And those are market-shifting signals. They are signals of intent that spur a lot of activity in this ecopreneur sphere. And then being able to also be an investor in the space. Salesforce has a ventures arm. We've invested, for example, in companies like Silvera, one of the carbon credit rating agencies. We've invested in early wildfire detection technology. We've invested in technology for grid balancing to make sure that the AI boom can be run without a huge new demand on baseload. So there's a lot of things you can do in the private sector that is just faster and easier. But we need both. As I said in the beginning, we need a strong UN. We need clarity on regulation. We also need governments everywhere to step up to this crisis, because it's also a crisis of leadership.
Can a tech company be a part of the bioeconomy?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll give you a few examples. So one of the customers we work with in Brazil is called Courageous Land, very aptly named little startup company. And they're not so little anymore. They're now getting towards their $100 million raise. What they do is agroforestry intelligence. So it's their version of AI, right? But they use Salesforce agentic AI to connect thousands of smallholder farmers in real time with supply and market demand. Because when you're an agroforestry farmer and you're restoring degraded pasture land, and they have several sites now across Brazil, you're working with 40 different products, everything from cocoa to coffee to bananas. And so marketing small amounts of produce at any given time and knowing where you get the best price, how can you aggregate the offtake, so also large customers like Nestle or Unilever can buy from you. That's a technology challenge.
Mm.
So the bioeconomy has huge data management and technology needs, and we're ready for that. So it's and I can give you a couple of other examples where we're testing now also with NGOs how this works. We're helping the Forest Stewardship Council, for example, to with an agentic AI to broaden their forest certification for thousands of small-scale forest owners who otherwise find it too tedious. There's like 500 pages of PDF to read through how to get forest stewardship certification. But an agentic AI can talk you through that on WhatsApp or whatever your preferred means of communication is, and then schedule an appointment with a representative once you're ready with the basic info. Can do that in French, Swahili or English or Spanish. These are all things where we can use AI to move things.
Expand the supply of sustainable
Yeah,
produced products. Yeah, that's
yeah,
that's always been a bottleneck, I think, in many certification schemes too.
exactly.
Tim, just switching the conversation a bit.
Mm.
I'm interested.
Where are we going, David? I'm curious. Where we to?
So I'm interested in the roles that boards can play in really helping to galvanize the companies that they're responsible for to go further and faster on sustainability. And if taking it from the specifics, from your own experiences with the Salesforce board, although obviously draw on that if you like, but what should board members be doing in order to support their sustainability function, however that's structured, however that's called and organized?
Well, and maybe with a nature focus too, just because there's something to be pulled on that thread.
Yeah, the answer to that is fairly simple, or it sounds simple. It's maybe more difficult to do, but pay attention. That's the answer. Because as soon as a board pays attention, and the board members don't even need to be experts, because every Fortune 500 companies, even a lot of SMEs, they have sustainability experts who will be thrilled when the board pays attention. So all you need to do is ask for a quarterly update report to the board, and that will move the needle in a lot of ways. Because if the board pays attention, the rest of the company pays attention to what you do because you have to report to the board. That is the single most important thing that a board can do to get these update reports, to have good internal governance. There are, of course, more extreme cases. There's a company in London called the House of Hackney, and they have
Great
put
book.
nature on their board. You've heard about this, I'm sure.
And we know Shar Love very
Shar
well.
is on their board as the representative of nature.
Yep.
And that's, of course, taking it to a new dimension. But even if you just start with the basics of paying attention, asking for quarterly or biannual update reports and presentations on sustainability, can be specific to nature, whatever is the most important material, opportunity, and dependency or risk of a company. But paying attention is the key.
So one of the key messages for 2026 to any company that's trying to make progress on sustainability is to do a gap analysis. Is the board asking for and receiving a regular update on sustainability issues relating to nature, but the other dimensions as well, and getting a progress report on actions being initiated and pursued?
Yeah, I would say that would be a big step forward, because that really shows the rest of the company that it is an important function. The other issue I would say is that has helped us a lot at Salesforce is when you have core values as a company that are clear to every employee. So Salesforce has 5 core values. We have customer success with trust, innovation, equality, sustainability. And when you have sustainability as a core value, it it also carries you through budget fluctuations, and it carries you through difficult headwinds. That is the other recommendation where I think it would make a difference to many companies.
Values are not completely extinguished these days. It's
Exactly.
important. So let's carry on the recommendations, because you said you've been engaged by many companies and NGOs. So what would be if a company is listening and they don't have a nature strategy so far? What are sort of some of the things they might think about to kind of build that kind of strategy?
Well, it almost doesn't matter where you start as long as you start, because things tend to be connected, and start
That's a very
where
nature-centric thing to
it's
say.
a very nature thing to say. Start with what is most important to you, and most companies, of course, have a feeling what that could be. For us, it's water, for example, because it's essential for power generation and data center cooling. And but for consumer goods companies, it is, of course, supply chain resilience. Nature provides basically all of your value chain. Then look at your supply chain and what you can do for resilience. It might be your reliance on biodiversity. Companies will usually know where to start that analysis, and there are now any number of great companies, ERM obviously being one of them, who do that and do that well. They did it for Salesforce, also for our nature assessment. So um, we I would say it start with what feels best and right to you, because most companies will of course know what their most likely nature related risks and dependencies are.
And if we look ahead, Tim, to 2030, what do you think um, are going to be some of the critical factors for nature leadership by companies over the next few years?
Regulatory certainty is certainly one of them. It's I think a mistaken belief that companies are always against regulation. That's not the case, because regulation levels the playing field. It gives you planning security. What many companies are not so fond of is the flip-flopping and the whiplash of that you get with complete shifts in policy within a very short time. And the other thing that, as a global company, we would love to see more of is harmonization of regulation that is related to sustainability and nature and also climate, because we now have to have specific emission reports that are different for France and Japan and Australia and the UK and the US and elsewhere. And that is just an additional burden and cost that we can do without, frankly, because we'd rather spend that time and money on real climate action. And technology can help to simplify that reporting, but we we need to see by 2030 to have a clear idea of where that arc of sustainability is headed. And to me, the answer to that is really clear, because in the long term, there is no choice, because you can define sustainability any number of ways, but it's easier to define unsustainability, because if something is unsustainable, it cannot be sustained, and you cannot carry on doing what you're doing. And I think it's clear with the current levels of climate change disruption, costs of inaction, the costs of extreme weather events, the sixth mass extinction crisis that we're in. These are all signs that we cannot continue with business as usual, and yet we seem to be under the illusion that we can. So that regulatory clarity and the arc of sustainability is I think clear, but it needs to be clearer to business leaders that this is a long-term trend. It's not going away.
Yeah, and I think this is but the incentives for short-termism are so overwhelmingly powerful, and I think especially as you get more senior in an organization and you feel the visceral expectations on short-termism, I think all these other things are harder to access, and the intangibility of the potential things going forward. So we do have a free, a systemic challenge, obviously, but there's a psychological component. And I think going back to that origin of your how do we fix this relationship with nature as a fundamental thing? Because it's broken, as you say, and maybe we do need to work on that bottom up process as well to really allow those incentives to be shifted over time.
But I
Yeah,
think
don't underestimate how important this is to staff also in big companies. We have in Salesforce about 15,000 people who are organized in our what's called Earth Force, our volunteer group that focuses on environmental causes, and they spend a lot of volunteering time on beach cleanups and restoration projects, and so they follow very closely what the company does. There's a lot of motivation that can be gained from being seen as proactive and doing things the right way. So even if you are under quarterly earnings report pressure, this is something that is in the long-term interest of companies. And yeah, it's sometimes hard to remember, but it doesn't go away.
And I think this takes us back to one of our earlier podcast episodes where we talked to Elizabeth Datey about corporate political responsibility and the responsibility of businesses, particularly those in kind of leadership positions who have this really clear overview of the challenges in this case of humankind's relationship or failing abusive relationship at the moment with nature, to be able to create the coalitions of the willing with other companies that are prepared to speak out together on that need for regulatory clarity to avoid those kind of whiplashes and to make sure that we are creating the pro-nature public policy environment.
Yeah, it's very challenging.
It's one of the reasons why Salesforce is in groups like Business for Nature, and we are launching large platforms that dozens or sometimes hundreds of other companies can join, like Pledge 1%. There's now 19,000 companies that have followed Salesforce's model of giving 1% of our product, of our staff time, of our equity to philanthropic causes. Almost $1 billion in philanthropic giving we're coming up to next year. So that leadership is really important. Another example is the Trillion Trees initiative that was started 5 years ago. There's now 93 companies engaged in investing in forest ecosystem restoration. We're going to do a full reboot of that platform.
How many
in
trees have we planted
Davos.
so far? Where are we? Where are we in that trillion goal?
Our commitment as Salesforce is 100 million out of that, which sounds small, but it's still a big goal. We're at about 60 million now this year. So we're doing good progress. Overall, companies have committed 9 billion trees. Governments, the US, Canada, China, an additional 120 billion. Implementation is still about 10% of that, so we're lagging behind on those numbers, but the amount of energy that this has generated in collaboration and public-private partnerships is phenomenal. I've seen this in many different places, but coming back to the Amazon, this idea that large companies would take a lot of money, pay it voluntarily with the voluntary carbon market for forest restoration, that confidence to be able to do that also relied on large partnerships and sort of safety in numbers of doing something together. Because if you learn a lesson and you're the only company doing something, it's very risky for a reputation to do it to do something that is proactive. But if you're a group of companies, you can learn together, you can improve together, you can share lessons. This whole sector matures and learns much faster. And that's what we've seen because of the Trillion Trees initiative in forest investments. So we're now rebooting the whole thing. Stay tuned for Davos in January.
As a former tree planter, that's music to my ears. So that's exciting. And I'll strap on the gear again if we need to, and the boots and the shovel. I'm in. Let's do a quick little rapid fire things. One, and maybe this is hard to do rapid fire, but carbon credits, biodiversity credits. This seems to be, we have these promises of getting them right, and there's these challenges related to legitimacy and authenticity, and the market seems wobbly. Like, well, what's your sense of where we are in this market?
I'm bullish on the voluntary carbon market and on high biodiversity quality carbon credits. I would love to see credits that do a lot of good, because if you separate this into carbon and biodiversity and water and livelihood benefits, they're all the same thing if you do it the right way. So as a company, and also for simplicity's sake, and this is where the UK is headed, for example, I would love to see investments that are measured against a number of benchmarks, carbon being one of them, biodiversity being one, water, livelihood benefits, so that you have a holistic investment. I don't want to see the market split into nature credits and carbon credits.
Uh-huh. And is that a risk that they could, and they kind of are, they've sort of been built that way a little bit?
There is actually a multi-billion-dollar market for nature credits that is mostly in habitat banking and offsets but that is not the nature credits that people are now talking about under the global biodiversity framework. I think it's unclear for me with nature credits where the demand should come from, because if this is voluntary and unless it becomes a compliance market, that market is always going to be small. It's way too small even for carbon credits, and there are hundreds of companies buying carbon credits, but even that market is way too small for the size of the problem. So the role of the VCM is mostly, in my view, as a research and development department for the larger compliance markets that exist and are being established around the world, because we have to know, including for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, what actually works
Mm.
when it comes down to investing money in a market-based mechanism. You can't just overnight create a multi-hundreds billions of dollars market and expect things to fall into place. You have to know what works, what can be scaled, and nature-based solutions are, of course, one of the big categories of scalable solutions that are important for carbon markets.
Great. So we need to go through that experimentation to get it right and build. David, what's a lot? I've got one final question for Tim, but go ahead. What do you have something else you want?
Well, I'm not sure if this is a quick fire question, but you talked about in the book $1 trillion nature restoration industry. Can you just very quickly unpick that for us?
The restoration industrial complex. It's good.
Yeah, I have a lot of discussions within my family about that term industry, because it's not well liked, because it has all this connotation of being a soulless commodity and profit-driven endeavor. But what I mean is the speed and scale of creating a booming business that has industrial scale. And if we treat nature as humanity's most important infrastructure, which it is, and we have large-scale infrastructure public works projects, there are simply no companies right now that you could call and say, we need to urgently restore all the UK's peatlands. The $2 billion, 2 billion pound project. There's no company you could call who would do that. Whereas if you build a 4-lane highway from Bristol to wherever, any number of engineering companies will bid on that tender. But who are your large-scale ecological engineering companies that are ready for that? And I think this will come, because it's inevitable that we invest in that infrastructure. As it is crumbling, it will hit the economy. It is already hitting the economy. You think about countries like Sri Lanka that are so dependent on tea exports, and the water is disappearing because the highland forest watershed is disappearing. So there's no more water for the tea, which grows underneath the high mountain forest covers. So no more forest, no more tea, no more export, no more economy. And rebuilding that infrastructure would take a couple $100 million, large World Bank loan, but a huge engineering project that has to be well planned with a very multidisciplinary team. Who are the companies who will do that? So we need to build this industry with the right scale in mind.
That's interesting. And it is very much an interesting skill set, and maybe if that is built, then the demand can be addressed.
Yeah.
Going back to the original premise again, preoccupied by this of the schism between us as part of nature and not. Which philosopher do we blame for this? Is it Descartes? Like,
Well,
when
absolutely. René Descartes is on my least favorite philosophers list, because of that reductionist thinking and the mind-body problem, saying
Yeah.
how can everything that is the body is basically to be disregarded, and then in that was included all the rest of creation, everything that's material. And I think we suffer from that distinction. But interestingly, this was why Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical was so important, because he reversed that, at least for the Catholic Church and for its 1 billion followers. He reversed that dogma and says, no, we are part of nature and we have to be stewards of creation. So Pope Francis was definitely on my top 10 list of philosophers.
Fantastic. Well, Tim, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Everyone should go buy Generation Restoration. It's a fantastic book, and you've given us so much of that here. So we really appreciate it. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Chris. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it. If you can, give us a rating. If you've got questions, you can find David, Mark, and I on LinkedIn, and we're happy to address them. But for now, thank you so much.